Can everyone hear me? Hi. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Thank you especially to Verso for hosting us and to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for sponsoring the event. My name is Gemma. I'm the associate editor at Dissent. You're all supporting Dissent by getting tickets tonight, and another great way to support Dissent is to subscribe to the magazine or to become a Solidarity subscriber. Our next issue, which is going to come out in January, is going to focus on municipal socialism. So if you want to read that, subscribe, and there are QR codes around the room. There are also copies of our current issue on the coffee table over there, so everyone should pick one up if you haven't already. So the way this conversation is going to go, I have some questions for our stellar panelists, and then I think there should be some time at the end for audience questions. And then after that, we can stay and hang out for a bit. And RLS and Verso have generously provided food and drinks, so thank you to them. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. Cea Ossé is the council member for New York City's 36th district, representing Bed-Stuy and North Crown Heights. He entered politics as an organizer and prominent figure in the Black Lives Matter movement. At 23 years old, Ossé was elected in 2021 as the youngest member of this council and its only Gen Z member. Last year, he passed the Fairness in Apartment Rental Expenses, or FAIR Act. He is a leader in New York City progressive politics and is at the forefront of new media and communications. Cea Weaver is the executive director of Housing Justice for All and the New York State Tenant Block, sibling organizations that work together to strengthen tenant organization, advocate pro-tenant legislation, and elect tenants and their allies to public office in New York. She has worked as an organizer, a researcher, and campaign strategist in New York housing policy for over a decade, running and winning campaigns to expand rent control, pass good cause eviction, and invest in affordable housing. She is an advisor on housing policy to Zohran Mamdani. And then finally, Josh Mason is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College at the City University of New York. He helps lead John Jay's master's programs in heterodox economics. He is a senior fellow at the Groundwork Collaborative, and his book, Against Money, co-authored with Arjun Jayadev, will be published by the University of Chicago Press in 2026. In July, he wrote for Dissent about how Zohran can govern, which was sort of the inspiration for this panel. So thank you all so much for participating. I wanted to start with a couple of broader questions. So you've all had conversations with Zohran since he won the primary in June. What advice have you given him about the dynamics of city politics and about moving from campaigning to governing?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to everyone in the audience for showing up and supporting this publication. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I've tried to give to Zohran is just to fill him in on the dynamics of the speaker's race, right, and the power of the speaker's office within the city council. The speaker will be essential in pushing Zohran's agenda forward within the city council, and I aim to just level set some of the dynamics that exist within our city council and where some members may be supportive in his efforts as being the next mayor of New York City.
That's good advice. Hey, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I think that was anyone at the rally last night? I know Chi was at the rally last night. Yeah, cool. One person was at the rally last night. You and many other people. So I think one of the things that you've seen Zohran say and say again and again and again, that we are trying to move from a left that is just critiquing to a left that is committed to delivering for working people. And that is really important. It's it's great. It's true. I mean, the goal is not to just win the election. The goal is to improve people's lives. And that means taking extraordinarily seriously the work of actually delivering for people on the things that they campaigned on. But beyond that, it takes really seriously keeping the 100,000 people who have signed up to volunteer for this campaign engaged in the work of government. And we know that if Zohran is going at it alone to Albany, trying to deliver on raising taxes for universal childcare, or going at it alone without the city council, he's not going to be able to actually do the things that he says he wants to do. And so it really will require that, millions of people see themselves in the work of making this administration successful. And he needs to take that extraordinarily seriously and think about what participatory governance really looks like in New York City.
Yes, thanks again for holding this event. So I would say two things here. First is sort of to reject a piece of advice that one often hears, which is that somebody in Zohran's position has to focus on one or a few issues, maybe on narrowly economic issues. I think that for somebody in an executive office, that's not feasible advice, and I don't think it's good advice. I think that, and I think the campaign, from my impression, understands this very clearly. They really have to move forward on everything at once, and that each victory that you win really creates additional space for further victories. And I think, again, in the campaign, we've seen very clearly that you can have a focus on affordability, but you can also be clear in your statements of solidarity with Gaza. It's not an either-or thing. And I think that spirit, hopefully, will carry over into the government, the administration. The second thing I would say is that a lot of the substantive programs that Zohran has run in are broadly popular, not just in general, but with a lot of Democratic elected officials, with Kathy Hochul, who's talked about the importance of achieving universal child care. And, a lot of the Assembly voted for the pilot program for free buses. So clearly there's an interest, if you have a pilot, in carrying that forward. So I think, the fight is not going to be over the broad points of principle, but over the implementation. And that's where you really, really have to get things right.
Cool, thank you, yeah. Oh, is the feedback okay? Okay. How about now? Better? Okay, awesome. So, Cea, you talked about going from a left that critiques to a left that delivers for working people. Obviously, the left in this country is not used to being in power. We're either used to being the vocal opposition or to being junior partners in a governing coalition. So, how should those of us who support the campaign's goals interact with Zohran once he's mayor? When should we be demanding? When should we be patient? And when we express our demands, how should we do that?
Well, that's a really good question. So I work, as you know from the introduction, I work in housing, so it's sort of my primary lens into this work. And so the first thing I would say is that making it easier for the mayor to build truly affordable housing is really critically important, and actually delivering on a promise of putting the public sector in the driver's seat when it comes to building more housing is a critical complement to the rent freeze demand, which I think everyone's really familiar with. Zohran's demand to freeze the rent, which will take work. It will not be easy. In addition to the rent freeze demand, we need to actually build more truly affordable housing. So I think the first thing we can do, I'm planning on voting yes on the ballot measures that are also on the ballot this fall. I really would encourage other people to do that as well. And one of the things about that I really want to highlight is that the ballot measures make it easier for the city to act as a market participant in purchasing distressed buildings and turning them into permanently affordable housing. If we are serious about putting the public sector in the driver's seat when it comes to housing production, we really need to be serious about what it takes to make the city be able to compete with private real estate developers. And these ballot measures are a step in the right direction that put the city on a more even playing field and put non-market actors on a more even playing field with some of the biggest real estate developers in the country. So that's one thing that those of you who want to be involved in making Zohran a successful mayor can do, and it starts on November 4th. Beyond that, there's lots of different levels of participatory government and small d democracy that is going to be really critically important to making Zohran successful. So organizing a tenant union in your building, using that tenant union to make sure that the city is calling 311. The city doesn't actually know what conditions are like in your building unless you tell them, you, the tenant, tells them. So there's lots of different ways in which we can actually make the city's code enforcement more effective by organizing with our neighbors and calling to put pressure to, code enforcement, any resource is a limited resource, and we have to tell the people where to go, the code enforcement inspectors where to go. Organizing a tenant association is one really easy way to do that. Get involved in your community board. Your community board has a critical role. Even if the ballot measures pass, it will still have a critical role in approving land use measures and building more affordable housing. I am tired of going and fighting at community boards for affordable housing. You could join one and fight for more affordable housing there. So there's lots of different ways like that where the city is the city is like ours to govern with Zohran, and we need to take that really seriously, and we really need to get involved in these little things. The last thing I will say about this is just I want to point to Chicago. Last week, there was a horrific incident of ICE sort of coming in on a building and disappearing dozens and dozens of people from a building. Where tenants are organizing, and more evidence is coming out about like why that happened, and part of it we now think is that there was a coordinated effort with the landlord who wanted the building to be empty, and ICE who knew that the building was home to lots of undocumented people. And that's not okay. And the way that we stop that solidarity is by organizing with our neighbors as tenants and saying that there's going to be if ICE and the National Guard are coming to New York City, ICE is already here. If the National Guard is coming on January 1st, which we know they are, we really have to use our tenant associations and our parent-teacher associations and our public schools as like networks of defense in support of Zohran's agenda and in support of our neighbors.
It's okay. I definitely want to echo some of Cea's points, and something I want to identify is that, yes, the left seldom wins, seats as powerful as New York City mayor. And because of that, we elect individuals who do not understand the powers of movement and the powers of coalition. And Zohran is an individual who comes from the movement, who comes from coalition building, who comes from this style of politics that includes co-governance. So we will have an opportunity over the next couple of years to actually co-govern with the mayor for once, rather than having to stand on the steps of City Hall and demanding, that the mayor does not lead with austerity. And that's something that I'm truly excited about with his leadership. And we saw that throughout the campaign, right? No one thought that Zohran would get this far, and he put together, alongside various different organizations, a coalition that pulled in other folks who did not believe in his campaign. So my advice to those who are figuring out how to be part of the change in our city and to work with the mayor and with our government on providing that change for each and every single one of us is to join that coalition, right? There are various different groups who helped get Zohran to this point, who are still organizing alongside him and fighting for increasing the housing supply, for tenants' rights, for workers' rights, for a greener New York City, and they all have that buy-in with Zohran even prior to him running for mayor. So he comes from coalitions, he comes from movements, and I'm really excited to finally be able to co-govern with the mayor rather than protest against the mayor.
Yeah. So I had a friend a number of years ago, an older person who'd been active in the movement against the war in the Vietnam era, and at some point he and some of his colleagues met with representatives of the Vietnamese communists and basically asked them, what can we do to be most effective in solidarity with you? A little different situation, but the questions they asked were things like, should we focus on mass rallies that can get large participation, or small disruptive actions that will need more committed activists? If a male member of the movement is drafted, should he evade the draft and avoid service, or should he join the army and try to radicalize the fellow soldiers? And the answer to all of these questions that they got was the same, which was some should do one and some should do the other. And I think that's an answer that really applies here too. I think we want to avoid false dichotomies between the sort of work of governing on the one side and movement building and more mass kind of oppositional politics on the other side. I think they're really mutually reinforcing and not in any way alternatives to each other.
Cool. So we've talked a bit about it so far. Multiple people on this panel are focused on housing, so I want to talk about housing next. It's been one of the most significant factors driving up the cost of living in the city, and it's been one of the most significant issues in the election. Josh, in the dissent piece you wrote this summer, you identified several strategies that a Mamdani administration could adopt to bring down the cost of housing, including zoning reform, public financing, and rent regulation. And you wrote that, and I'm quoting here, a housing program that included substantial land use reforms and public financing could peel off support from a significant fraction of developers, even if landlords were strongly opposed. Cea, you praise this aspect of the piece and what it suggests about the kind of housing coalition that Zohran can build. You've also expressed some concerns that a rent freeze will prompt landlords to engage in a capital strike, meaning withholding updates and repairs to their properties. So given that the interests of these different groups, meaning renters, landlords, and developers, are at odds, what kind of housing coalition can Zohran build? And then what kind of housing agenda can he advance that, delivers on a rent freeze and moves beyond it, and also moves beyond Eric Adams's City of Yes agenda?
So I'll go first. I think that is one of the things, to me, a strength of the Zohran program on housing is it's very much a both-and program. It gets out of this sort of stale NIMBY-YIMBY debate that I think has really obstructed a lot of progressive conversations about housing, and recognizes that we do want more private development. We do want to make it easier to build housing and reform the zoning rules where that's required. And we do, as Cea said a moment ago, want to see these ballot measures pass in November, and hopefully Zohran himself will come out clearly in favor of them. There's another piece of the puzzle that I think we have to really talk about, which is that there is a reality that a lot of existing landlords are genuinely struggling to pay their expenses, including their debt service. We have a lot of building owners who took on high levels of debt prior to the 2019 rent law reform in the expectation that they would be able to rapidly raise rents, and obviously in many cases that means kick out their existing tenants, and the building, now that they no longer have that ability to do that, the building income does not cover the mortgage costs, the debt service costs. And this is, you can say, well, this is their own fault. They're speculators. They made a bad bet. That's not a problem for us as society, but it is a fact. It's not just a matter of sort of capital strike where they would voluntarily kind of refuse to do upkeep as a political gesture. It's an actual objective fact from their point of view that the income the building generates doesn't cover the mortgage payments they have to make. And I think any program that reduces rents or even prevents rents from rising is going to have to face up to that fact that a lot of buildings are carrying a level of debt that is only sustainable if rents do go up. And you have to actually address that problem. What will happen if you don't address it, of course, is that a lot of landlords will choose not to do necessary maintenance rather than miss, because they, if they don't pay the lender, they lose ownership of the building. So they'll prefer to defer maintenance and sacrifice the habitability of the building rather than miss their debt payments. And so, you have to deal with that problem. One side, obviously, is aggressive code enforcement, that you really don't let them get away with not doing maintenance. But you can't just say, okay, the landlords have to pay. The landlords actually, in many cases, genuinely do not have the income to meet these debt payments, or there's a very thin margin there. And so whether the solution there looks like the city taking ownership of these buildings, buying out landlords in some form, or whether it's some situation where you negotiate with the lenders to get a write-down, but there's a genuine problem there, and not just a sort of subjective inclination of landlords to want more money, which of course they also have. One interesting model here, when Signature Bank failed, in the wake of the Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank here in New York also failed. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, ended up with about 3,000 mortgages to New York apartment buildings. And what ended up happening is those were transferred to the Community Preservation Corporation that arranged write-downs of the loan. Okay, we'll write off some of the value of the loan if you make a binding commitment to do the deferred maintenance and keep up the habitability of these buildings. That was easier there because the government actually owned the mortgages because the bank had failed. But I think there's something like that model that might be available. But one way or another, you have to deal with the problem that if you hold rents down, you do create genuine financial distress for a lot of over-leveraged landlords.
I love how you said both and. As a former theater gay, I think yes and is something that I always say when I reply to, when I respond to the housing crisis. I think you're absolutely correct. There are numerous intricacies that have gotten us into this position with this housing crisis. Something that I love that you said, that I'm aiming to push this administration on and would love to see expanded is for HPD to be fully funded as well as expanded. I think this agency, which is supposed to be supporting those, supporting tenants within New York City, has been neglected by this past mayor, whether it was his association to real estate or not. Just through my own experience of working with tenants and tenants associations on trying to get the repairs to a tenant through HPD has been very difficult. Either, they're understaffed, either they're underpaid. This agency needs to be expanded so that we can identify the units that are being warehoused and whether they need to be reinvested in by the city and the state so that they're up to code for tenants to live in them. We need to make sure that the agency is enforcing some of the housing laws that both the city and the state have put in place. Right, we're still unsure on if HPD is really enforcing good cause eviction. Right, so I totally agree with you on the predicament that we are in. And in addition to that, this next mayor, this next administration, the city as a whole needs an agency that will deeply be enforcing the laws that are in place, assessing the situation that we are in so that we can address the housing shortage, address the warehousing crisis, and to make sure that in those cases where units need funding and landlords don't have that funding, to find a pathway for those apartments to be invested in so that tenants and people can live in them.
I agree with everything that everyone has said. Great, very smart panel. A couple things that I would just that I want to add to complicate the conversation. The first is that landlords are in a unique position of being able to say that they don't have any money to make repairs, but also being able to make that true because they're the ones who are supposed to be doing the repairs. And so the code enforcement piece is really important because the truth of the matter is we actually really don't know how landlordism is an extraordinarily shadowy business. So landlords are not forced to open their books.
They should unionize. They should unionize. I'm saying that right here tonight.
Yeah. They don't have to do anything. We don't know. It's very crazy. The Rent Guidelines Board is supposed to look at landlords' expenses and operating costs, but landlords often don't really share with the RGB what they don't want to open their books. And if they open their books, we would probably see that what they typically do is they buy buildings and then they take the value out of the buildings to buy more buildings and so on and so forth. And so speculation is at the core of the problem, and we have great tools to interrupt that, but those tools really require the city and the public sector being a really serious alternative. And a serious alternative doesn't mean, it doesn't just mean that, the city's going to take the building and transfer it to the tenants or transfer it to a not-for-profit landlord or whatever. Those landlords aren't necessarily higher quality landlords. And that's really important to understand is we actually need a serious public sector alternative. The not-for-profits aren't quite that. NYCHA could be that, but NYCHA has a lot of problems itself. And so I think we need to take really seriously what the question of long-term ownership of the housing stock looks like under a socialist administration. And there's two ways I sort of think about it. It's would you rather be a member of a worker co-op where you have to make sure your workers are paid on time and you have to pay your taxes and you have to deal with all that shit? That's one option. It's hard work. Another option is would you rather be a member of a union and then negotiate with your boss for a better contract? And that's also hard work and requires a lot of work. And so I personally, I know my answer to that question. I'd rather be a union member and have a really strong tenants association that's organizing with my landlord for regular meetings, collective bargaining, a commitment to live in a certain way. But some people might prefer the worker co-op model. That's cool too. But the bottom line is that the housing system that we are dreaming of under the Zohran administration actually doesn't. The city's tools exist. The city needs to use them more effectively, but it requires us to get organized, whether it's there's no answer to this crisis that doesn't mean you can escape going to a meeting in your lobby with your neighbors. I'm sorry to tell you that. But whether you're bargaining a lease with your landlord or whether you are collectively managing your building, that's part of the answer.
vibe checking. Are we using too many acronyms when describing city agencies? And if yes, would you like us to break down what those acronyms are?
Okay, there's RBG.
There's RBG, the Rent Guidelines Board, NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, HPD, the Housing and Preservation Department.
Yeah.
And any other acronyms we'll break down for all of you so we can get out of Alphabet Soup Town.
So, Cea, you said that we need to develop serious public sector alternatives. Are there any models that we should look to on that, or are we building the plane as we're flying it here?
Well, I think that the truth is that New York City has the most sophisticated public financing agencies in the country. And it's not really a question of new things that we need to do, but it's a question of lining them up in the right way to ensure that the value of real estate development in the city is maintained in the public sector. We have a lot of limited equity cooperatives. We still have public housing, which many cities in the country does not have. In 2021, New York City passed something called the New York City Housing Authority Preservation Trust, which allows us to buy more public housing, build more public, it is a really flexible tool that really expands the public sector's ability to do stuff. So I don't mean this to sound trite, but it really is a question of political will. We already have the tools, and we kind of have to line them up. And one of the things, I feel like this is maybe my third time on this panel saying it, but it is a question of the city getting comfortable with some more ownership in, sorry to use I'm about to use a buzzword, in Vienna, as people who follow housing. One of the things that they do is when land or buildings are for sale, the city buys them. And so the question that I really want Zohran's administration to take seriously is what would it take for the city to be a really serious market actor that can compete with related group, because that's how this will work.
So, Cea, you've made housing a big part of your agenda while you've been in the council. I'm curious about what you think the council's role will be in working with Zohran on his housing agenda and what you think he should focus on, and especially because I'm curious about the dynamics right now more broadly, given that there's this, as you mentioned, contested speaker race, which will be hugely significant for what parts of Zohran's agenda he can pass, especially regarding land use. So can you talk about the significance of this race, and importantly, what should we be pressuring our council members to do?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I'm excited about Zohran's housing agenda and how it relates to my housing priorities during my time in the council. Zohran ran on a campaign of wanting to build 200,000 affordable homes across the 5 boroughs. The council can aid him in those efforts in identifying swaths of land that need to be rezoned. For example, this past year, I just greenlit over 4,000 units of housing in Central Brooklyn. We did a mass rezoning on Atlantic Avenue where we identified, this corridor that was deeply underutilized. There's just gas stations and warehouses, and saw that as an opportunity for comprehensive rezoning that we worked with community on for 3 years, to get a great deal to approve that corridor for housing. I'm excited to now work with a mayor that I like more, who has a backbone. It was interesting working on that project with Eric Adams and his administration, because every single meeting there would be different people because they would all be leaving. So it was it was kind of sad. And there were some good people. I'm looking forward to using that same model that I approached that comprehensive rezoning with a mayor who, again, gets it and cares about the city. And I know that there are numerous colleagues of mine who are looking forward to doing the same, and also his, priorities to making sure that a lot of that housing will be affordable, and making sure that that housing is subsidized by city and hopefully state dollars is going to be something that I will prioritize with my time in the council. In terms of the speaker's race, I think in the speaker's race, on the issue of housing and increasing housing supply, I think that Zohran will be okay. In terms of tenants' rights and strengthening some of our laws that support tenants, I'm hoping that we get a speaker who he can work with on that. And there are different options for speaker right now, and I don't think all are on the same page about supporting tenants as they are listening to REBNY. So what's
that acronym?
Oh, REBNY, there's another one. They're suing me right now. The Real Estate Board of New York. They're nice people.
They're the masters of the universe.
They are the masters of the universe. They're crazy people. Yeah, I'm. What can the people do? Kind of nothing. The speaker's race is kind of the only thing that you can't really get involved in. I mean, it's a very insider's race, right? I mean, I know that there are some candidates who are publicizing, their candidacy, but the votes are obviously up to the 51-member body of the city council, right? And unfortunately, during my time in the council, I found that not a lot, but some people take an individualistic approach to the speakership where they'll approach a speaker's candidate and be like, I want this committee that no one will ever remember me chairing, but it's my number one thing that I want, and I'll give you a vote for speaker, and then that person has, a vote. And a lot of people can get bought out in the speaker's race. So I think there's maybe a speaker's candidate that folks in this room should look up and maybe see if you like their platform and how they've been moving in the council, and then maybe demand that your council member doesn't vote for them for speaker. But it's not coming to the top of mind right now. I have no idea. But I think that's the most amount of participation that the public will be able to do when it comes to the speaker's race. I'm already speaking too much.
I can say it. No, but in all seriousness, one of the things about the speaker's race is that there are a lot of people, including REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York, who really see the speaker's role as being a foil to the mayor and not a collaborator with the mayor in getting an affordability agenda done. And I think there are I think it is really, really important that the speaker is somebody who wants to work with Zohran so that we can deliver on the agenda that he ran on. And we need to move beyond Zohran as candidate to what is the movement that is going to make Zohran actually be successful. I think it's nationally important that he is successful in terms of what do we want the Democratic Party to look like? What does standing up to Trump look like? And if the speaker's role is to be a foil to the mayor, I don't know that we're going to be able to do that in the same way. Yeah.
Which I think is funny because, in the last speaker's race, that wasn't a conversation, right? When it came to picking a speaker's candidate, when it came to the unions getting involved and the Real Estate Board of New York getting involved. And we ended up with, frankly, a moderate Republican mayor and a moderate speaker. And now, because we have a Democratic Socialist as the mayor, we're like, oh, we need the counterbalance now, which is complete bullshit. So hoping that we have someone who's going to be more of a collaborator, because that's what we need in a time where Trump's government is going to be trying to hurt our city. So we need a speaker who will be supporting our mayor.
Yeah, that's right.
Amazing. So we talked about this a little bit before we started the panel. I'm curious if you all can talk more about the economics of the rent freeze and the practicalities of that. I mean, I think it's talked about in this way that's oh, it's so easy. They just freeze the rent. But I think in reality, it's more complicated than that. So I'm curious, if you can talk more about what that's going to look like and the impacts it's going to have. And then I think beyond the rent freeze, once the rent is frozen, how can the administration continue to mobilize tenants as a political force? And, you're talking before, when we started talking about housing, about the fact that some landlords are genuinely struggling with debt. How, does mobilizing tenants, will that come into conflict with, initiatives that will maybe rebalance that, initiatives to help struggling landlords, basically, and bringing them into a coalition if that's desired?
Yeah, I'll start. So the Rent Guidelines Board is a public mayorally appointed board of 9 people, and they adjust the rent annually. And they have the power to reduce rent as they did in Kingston, New York. They reduced rent by 15%. They have the power to freeze it, as de Blasio did 3 times during his term. And under Bloomberg and Adams and like any mayor you can name, they raised the rent. But it's a really interesting body because it's a place where there are tenant reps on the board, there are public members on the board, there are tenant members on the board. If you want to be on the board, you should let someone know. It's unpaid. Well, it's paid $100. But they adjust rent annually for 2.4 million people. It's like
Landlord, it's a paid position.
If you're a landlord, it's a paid position. Yeah, that's a good point. So it is a really exciting model of rent stabilization that takes into account both like keeping rents, like sort of the public's ability to control the rents, but also like a good degree of public participation. And I think that's it's unique and exciting. There's like other newer models of rent stabilization sort of just base it on the consumer price index, which is an apolitical, well, everything's political, but it's a little bit more apolitical and it doesn't take into account the power of organized people. So I love the Rent Guidelines Board, even though it's a bit of a charade every year, and it brought us this great mayor, hopefully, knock on wood. We haven't won the election yet. Like Josh mentioned, and I'm really curious for more of your take, it is true that real estate speculation and the rent freeze is something that is like causing a crisis for the industry, but it's not the only thing that's causing a crisis for the industry. It's important to note that insurance costs have gone up like crazy, property taxes are totally out of whack, Trump's tariffs and the way that Trump is like fucking with the housing economy. Sorry, I didn't want to swear, but I did. Messing with the economy is causing a huge amount of uncertainty in the housing market, and the rent freeze is a scapegoat for the industry, and they are going to try to use it to punish Zohran. But the truth is that these landlords are not making or breaking their money on a 0% or a 3% rent increase. The truth is it's like a much bigger problem, and rent freeze is forcing a conversation about like what size of returns real estate wants. For many, many years, real estate, if you're a homeowner, you're not expecting to get really wealthy off of your home. You're like, okay, I'm going to buy my home. I'm going to like make some returns. I'm going to like sell it so I can, get into a retirement community and then die in a retirement community. Your home is so that you don't die in poverty. It's not about getting you rich, And so for landlords, they moved from expecting like regular, 401k style retirement returns in real estate to expecting like 20%, 30% private equity style returns in real estate. That is a problem that we're trying to have to like adjust downward for, and it's like real estate speculation problem. Josh mentioned the signature intervention. That was very cool, and it took a lot of work from some of the folks in this room, like including Celeste, who's here from the comptroller's office. But like a lot of people sort of like interrupted, like tried to use public sector money to interrupt this massive foreclosure in the signature, or this massive sort of bank failure in the signature portfolio. There's someone else here, I forget your name, I'm sorry, who's a Pinnacle organizer. Pinnacle is a big landlord in Cheese District and all over the city. Pinnacle is a big landlord that's going into distress right now. In bankruptcy, we could buy all of those buildings. There's like these interventions for failing landlords that we need to like take into account. So I think looking at opportunities like what's happening with Pinnacle, like what happened with Signature, and the lessons from the 2008 financial crisis will help us get through the next phase.
Yeah, I just want to amplify a couple of things that Cea said. I mean, first about the Rent Guidelines Board, I think this is a really important point that it obviously stabilizes rents, which is very important, but it also politicizes rents, or more precisely, it makes the political nature of rents visible. It makes it something for sort of democratic debate and discussion and decision-making. And, sort of the argument that has been made for living wage laws, which may or may not, unlike the Rent Guidelines Board actually really does effectively limit rent increases. Living wage laws maybe in some cases only affect a relatively small number of workers, but they have this larger value, which is establishing the principle that wages are not just a market outcome, they're something we can collectively decide on the basis of political and moral and, other factors. So I think that's a side of the Rent Guidelines Board we shouldn't, we should elevate and hopefully try to, reproduce in other areas. The other point, I think the way to think about it with landlords, there's sort of there is another pole here, which is finance, and that lenders and also insurance, which are where a lot of rents are ultimately going to. And in that sort of limited sense, there is a common interest between landlords and tenants and the public, very limited sense. And I think there are some opportunities there. I think the Zohran campaign is very interested in whether there's sort of a public option for insurance that could actually reduce costs for landlords, and that would then make it easier for them to operate in an environment of a rent freeze. And you could look at some utilities in the same way. If you can reduce their costs for electricity and heat and so on, then that can make it easier for them to accept a rent freeze. But I think the fundamental issue here is you've got a squeeze between, you've got to enforce codes much more strongly than are already being done, and you've got the rent freeze coming on the other side, so you're not letting them cut costs. You are reducing their income. And for a lot of landlords, that's going to be a problem, and the outlet there is probably some form of public ownership, which is why it's so important, as Cea was saying earlier, to figure out what a good model of public ownership or nonprofit ownership actually looks like. Because I think, and this is a point I really want to emphasize here, we tend, I think, sometimes to think of public ownership as sort of an outcome. Well, it's some ultimate goal. It's sort of maybe a luxury in the short run that we should be thinking about for some future date. But I think in a really concrete way, public ownership is actually a solution to some very concrete problems that are otherwise very hard to solve. And this is one of them. If you have landlords who we are not going to let them cut costs on the one side, leaving aside, insurance and whatever stuff we can actually bring down in a way that doesn't hurt tenants, and we're not going to let them raise rents on the other side, and they have a commitment to their lenders, and something has to give. And one way you break that is by saying, okay, you can get out of your ownership position. We will buy you out at a reasonable price. It's a solution to what otherwise is sort of a battle of conflicting forces that can't be resolved. So public ownership is actually a pragmatic solution to that problem. And I think the same thing goes on the development side. I think a lot of us, in this room, believe that we should have more housing development, that is an important part of the solution, is to build more housing, including, private housing, and that including making it, City of Yes is a step in the right direction in that sense. I think I would say that. I can't speak for the other panelists. But yes, but it may not go as far as one would like, because the problem is that for developers, they expect a very high return. You've got equity investors in housing who are providing, 30, 40, 50% of the financing who want a 20% return. And lenders who for construction loans are also asking for very high interest rates. And so you're not going to be able to build housing that is going to, charge significantly lower rents or sell at significantly lower prices and still be attractive to a lot of developers. So it may be that the benefits of simply relaxing zoning restrictions may be a lot less than we would think, at least in terms of affordability. Maybe you can build a lot more housing that's approximately as expensive as what we've got now. And the way, again, you get out of that box is to have the public sector play a larger role as an investor, either as the financer or as the equity investor that's actually going to end up owning the housing. And it's not, again, this isn't sort of like our ultimate goal of socialism, maybe it is consistent with that, but it's also just a pragmatic solution to the problem that the big constraint on the development of housing in a lot of cases is profitability, where private investors expect a very high return before they're willing to undertake new projects.
Cool. I want to talk more about the economics of Zohran's vision more broadly. So I'm going to quote again from Josh's dissent piece over the summer, in which he wrote that the substantive goals of Mamdani's proposals, that is, expanded public services, including universal childcare and truly affordable housing, are, at least notionally, shared by the Democratic mainstream. But the mainstream resists the new taxes that would make them possible. In this context, the challenge in winning state support may be less about making the case for the program on principle and more about demonstrating a credible plan to carry it out. So I'd like to hear more from all of you about the obstacles to Zohran's agenda, especially in Albany, but also at home. Has anything changed in the last few months as several mainstream Democrats, including Kathy Hochul, though notably not all, have fallen in line behind Zohran? And also, will Trump's financial retaliation against the city and the budgetary problems it could cause be a significant factor?
Zohran set a mandate in his victory in the primary and will continue doing so in this general election. And he set the tone for what Democratic leadership should look like in this city, state, and country. His platform resounded with thousands of New Yorkers and prioritizing affordability. And there are a lot of questions, especially from Democratic or just establishment pundits in general, who asked the question, how is he going to pay for all of this? And his mandate is going to be able to pay for all of this, right? Today, Governor Hochul just said that she's already looking into how to make universal childcare possible, right? This movement that is taking place right now, this political movement that is taking place right now, is again setting the tone for what is possible and giving some of those more timid Democrats and elected officials in the city and state an opportunity to dream a little bigger and to follow his lead. So I truly believe that the partnership between Zohran and Kathy is going to be essential in pushing his agenda forward. We're already seeing that take place prior to the general election. She just announced that, again, they're going to make universal childcare possible, and I truly believe that will extend further to building hundreds of thousands of affordable homes, that will extend to making sure that buses are fast and free, which he's done in the past and will continue to do when he works with the state legislator in the future. So I'm looking forward to him continuing to do what he's already doing and making sure that there's partnership between the city and state in making his agenda possible.
I mean, it will take a lot of work in Albany. Is Trump a threat? Of course, Trump is a threat. There's no way around that, and it is extraordinarily scary to think that he is becoming mayor at a time when housing markets are in turmoil, when Trump is cutting social services, and there's a massive healthcare crisis coming to the city because of Trump, and. This is not something that municipal socialism can fix on its own. And to me, it really does come back to the question of when do we push him? When do we push other people? How do we understand our power map differently? Where it's our job is to help Zohran deliver on the things that he said he would deliver on. And if he is not delivering on them, understanding the power map of why and figuring out a way to figure out what the levers that we can pull are, whether that's more pressure on our members of Congress here in New York. I mean, the leaders of the Democratic Party nationally are here in New York. And so if they're not, and completely flopping, So we actually, not just here in New York State, here in New York City, actually I think both of them live within 10 blocks of my house, actually. And your house. And so I think that we really need to take seriously what are the levers of power that we have and how are we pulling all of them in a really holistic way. Albany's a problem, but I mean, I think I guess the last thing I will say about this is growing the coalition and wielding power is uncomfortable, and somebody always says it. I don't remember who always says it. I did not come up with it, but if your coalition is just everybody who agrees with you, if you're comfortable in your coalition, you're not winning power. And so we actually have to be a little bit uncomfortable right now with some of that. When Kathy Hochul was I support Zohran's agenda. I'm do you? Right. But that's great, actually.
Kathy Hochul has an election next year, and she doesn't have a shoe-in to re-election, right? Especially post-2024. We can't take any elections for granted. Republicans are going to be going hard in that race, right? And a lot of parts of the city have turned more red because of the 2024 election. So this is an opportunity to leverage Zohran's agenda and pressuring the governor to make sure that some of these programs that critics may call pie in the sky are actually possible and feasible.
Yeah, the most exciting thing I think for all of us in this moment is that Zohran is not just operating successfully within the existing political constraints, but he's shifting the political constraints, and things that seemed out of the realm of possibility are in the realm of possibility, and that changes the calculations for people in Albany as well. And obviously, somebody like Kathy Hochul is extremely, I think, willing to adapt her agenda if she thinks that's what's going to help her get reelected. And so I think in principle there's a lot of space there. At the same time, there are trade-offs sometimes between principles and political constraints, as there always are, but I think a little more sharply here because Zohran is so important, not just as a mayor of New York, but as a model for the rest of the country. And so the compromises you make to achieve your agenda are costly in the sense of muddling that. And so one concrete example I have in mind is, a lot of the Zohran agenda is going to cost money. And in principle, I think there's a lot of space to raise taxes in New York City and New York State, but the Governor Hochul has said very clearly she's against, raising the personal income tax, PIT, but I will spell it out, personal income tax. But on the other hand, she does seem to be open to at least a higher New York City payroll tax, meaning just essentially a flat tax or with some exemption on wages. Clearly, we would prefer millionaires tax, but if the way we get universal child care and free buses funded is with a payroll tax, maybe that's a compromise that you have to be willing to make. It's something I've heard this. I don't know, maybe, but we could call it a hypothetical, but this is something I've heard.
So I think I want to do one final question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So there's obviously very few places in this country where the left is in power. Not only are we not used to being in power, there's not that many examples of it. And one example people have brought up, which is not a great one, is Brandon Johnson's Chicago. It's a fraught example for some reasons. And so I guess I'm just wondering, what mistakes can Zohran learn from, historical and contemporary, and then what models can he look to? I know Cea brought up Vienna already. That one's talked about a lot, but we can talk more about Vienna. But beyond that, is there anyone he should try to emulate, any policy he should try to emulate, anywhere he can look to learn?
I know you're not saying this, but I find that oftentimes Mayor Brandon Johnson in Chicago is always compared or is being used as a comparison of what people should be wary about with Zohran. And it's so funny that people do that when it comes to mayors or elected officials who are on the left, because when you look at the resume of moderate elected officials, we have Eric Adams, flop, Lori Lightfoot, flop. I don't know. All the other ones flop, but exactly. The list goes on and on. There's too many to name them right now, but I think Mayor Wu is a great example for Zohran and to look to as how to lead, right? And she just won her primary or her election with over 60% of the vote. She's led Boston with this economic populist agenda that speaks to the affordability crisis, that emphasizes the need for improving our transportation systems, spoken up in support of, banning forced broker fees in Boston and taking after my lead, of course. And, I think she's a great example for Zohran to look to. I think he's already spoken up about how he appreciates her leadership.
I think people are a little too hard on Brandon Johnson, to be honest with you. Brandon Johnson just passed a huge huge initiative to fund new social housing construction. He fought really hard in his first term to expand, raise a millionaire's tax in order to fund services for homeless Chicagoans. I almost said homeless New Yorkers. That's right. I think he could have maybe done a better job sort of coalition building around that payroll tax than he did. But one of the things that I think he's doing a great job on right now, for example, is standing up to Trump. And I really think that Zohran could look to Johnson for how he has really made the city of Chicago a fighting force against ICE and the National Guard. And we should really look to what Brandon Johnson, and as well as the Chicago Teachers Union, is doing to really use the schools and the city as sites of resistance against a federal incursion. I think that, de Blasio was a good mayor in a lot of ways and a not so good mayor in a lot of ways. And so there's actually living examples of how de Blasio used the city's administration to get out in the neighborhoods and sign people up for universal childcare. There's also ways of de Blasio de Blasio took real steps to alienate his base. And so I think we have to we can learn from a mistake. We can learn from that mistake just as we learn from the mistake of leveraging the city as a massive community outreach operation too.
Another mayor, Mayor Brandon Scott of Baltimore, Zohran's platform around reimagining what public safety looks like and putting together the Department of Community Safety can be mirrored after what Brandon Scott has been doing with maybe a not so police-centered approach to public safety, and has seen a significant drop in crime in Baltimore by utilizing community leaders as protectors and violence interrupters within Baltimore. I don't think he gets nearly enough credit, and I do believe that Zohran should look towards his leadership when it comes to public safety and what he wants to implement within his plan.
Cool. Thank you. If you have questions, you can raise your hand, and we'll do several. And we're not going to pass the mic, so if you could maybe stand up and project, that would be great. And I see a first hand in the back.
Someone was ready back there.
Yes.
That hand went up.
Going back to John Jacob Astor, this town has been run by the finance, insurance, and real estate industry. And
Could we get to the question portion of this, maybe? Is there
wait,
a
was
question
there a
there?
question?
Is there a question there?
the question is, how is he going to administer the complexity of
Sure. Yeah, and I appreciate you canvassing for him. That was really, thank you for doing that. I think that you raised some points, and I really do encourage you to read a recent profile that came out about Mamdani today, because I think it really speaks to the true nature of who he is as a leader, right? And I think there's a lot of different narratives that are being placed on him, sometimes with bad faith. But Zohran, as I said before, is a coalition builder. He speaks to everyone. He meets with everyone. He will discuss anything with anyone and will learn from people and incorporate that within his leadership. Pardon? You'll have to just look up the New York Times magazine profile that came out today, and it really dives deep into who Zohran is as a leader, and some of those problems that you raised about his relationship to real estate or maybe corporations. It touches on that and how even folks within the business world were pleasantly surprised with meeting with Zohran and hearing about what his vision for New York looks like, and what his priorities are, and how they sometimes intersect with those that may deem him to be evil.
mean, the troops in the street, I think, is hard to say much about in advance. I believe that there will be massive resistance, and I believe that Zohran will do what he can. But I don't think that's something we can really plan for. Certainly, I have nothing much to. On the second question, though, I think we can talk a little bit. I think that something that we're going to need to see in New York and nationally is state and local governments taking over some of the functions that have formerly been performed by the federal government. We're already seeing the beginning of this. You know, whether this is a short-term thing under Trump or whether this is a longer-term shift in American politics, I don't know. But certain basic responsibilities for things like public health, you know, are already shifting to the states, because we can't, if the federal government is not going to play this role, it cannot simply be abandoned. We actually need to know which drugs are safe to take, and somebody needs to be checking the water and seeing that it's drinkable and so on. So to the extent that we necessarily see these functions shifting to the states, we're going to need to see more spending at the state and local level. And of course, we've had a huge tax cut for the wealthiest at the federal level. There's no reason in principle that a substantial part of that could not be taken back by New York State and New York City. And I think we have overwhelming evidence that rich people do not choose where they're going to live on the basis of taxes, at least not anywhere within, I mean, you could take 100% of their wealth and maybe they would relocate. But within the range of taxes that we have in the United States, we see rich people gathered in the highest tax jurisdictions, enormous numbers of millionaires in San Francisco and Connecticut and New York City, which are, you know, very high tax places. So there's no question in principle that the state and the city could raise taxes on the wealthy and replace a lot of the funding that's being lost at the federal level. Obviously, a huge political challenge to do that, but I don't think there's any in principle reason why we cannot do that. And I think in a certain sense, there's an actual opportunity there to sort of demand that our local governments step up and fill the space that the federal government is abandoning. And I think we really need to approach it that way, as an opportunity and not simply as something that we have to accommodate to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And already some of the work that Zohran is doing and building a relationship with Governor Hochul is setting the stage for what may potentially come in terms of cuts from the federal government and the involvement of the National Guard here in the city.
So I think it's important to understand that the line between public and private in the United States is extraordinarily blurry, right? And so I believe in your district, the atrium is in your district, right? So in Cheese District, there's a beautiful new 100% affordable for seniors housing building. You should look it up. It's gorgeous. And designed by it's on the campus of Sumner Houses, and it was designed by this like famous architect Daniel Libeskind, and he's like got a gorgeous like profile about like why he thinks it's so important that like famous architects build beautiful public sector housing. It's public land, it's public financed, it's private management, and like does that, and it's long-term publicly owned, and a private company is collecting the rent. Does that count as public? That's a question. And so I think that if the answer is that buildings that are on public land with a long-term public ownership stake, with public money financing the development of the housing, but a private company collecting the rent, if that is public, the answer is yes. There is quite a lot of it that has been built in the last 10 years. If you are looking for public management, public ownership, public financing, no private subsidy, no private money at all in it, there's not that much of that left. I mean, there's still Section 9, but that's pretty much the only model, and there hasn't been new construction of that. But I just think that, there's I'm trying to not get sort of too technical with it, but the truth is, the point that I would like to land is that I think, this line of what is public or not isn't actually that easy of a question to answer. And if we are looking if what we are looking to do is take things that are like right now 100% private and speculated and pull them in the direction of public, there's some really good examples of that.
Yeah, I just want to amplify that because I think it's such a critical point that Cea just made, that it's really misleading to think in terms of public and private. There's especially in New York, an enormous range of buildings with intermediate ownership models, intermediate financing models. And in some ways, it's almost not even the question we should be interested in because, at the end of the day, you have a certain amount of public money that is going into the building or not. You have rules about rent. You have rules about maintenance. You have rules about who gets rented to and what the systems are for that. And the notional owner is maybe not the most important question there. And the degree of public involvement is sort of smoothly varies whether or not it's a public entity whose name is on the title. The other thing about warehousing, I think. And I will defer to see if she thinks differently, but I don't think that's the issue. I don't think there's a significant amount of vacant housing in New York City that is being held vacant by landlords. Landlords are in business to make a profit, for better or worse, often for worse, but in this case for better because there's really no incentive for a landlord to not rent out a unit that they have available to them. I think the thing that we really should be concerned, and statistically we know there just aren't very many vacant units, and the ones that are often owned by some rich person who's it's being warehoused by the tenant, not by the building owner. Or not by the tenant, but like in a. Yeah, so the issue I think for landlords is the maintenance spending, that the landlord who's the behavior that we want to curb on the part of landlords is not doing adequate maintenance. In some cases, obviously, they charge more than the legal rent, and that's also a problem. But I think the warehousing of vacant units is a little bit of a non-issue in New York City.
I think we can do one more question.
I support commercial rent stabilization, and I know that there's a bill that we're still trying to improve in the city council that we're work towards that. You do raise a great point on some of these costs with corporate with landlords in terms of their costs increase, therefore that cost is placed onto small businesses or the tenants that are within those buildings. I do agree with you. I do think there is still a sizable amount of landlords and corporate landlords within the city who are not in dealing with financial hardships, right? And my goal and goal of a couple of my colleagues in the city council is to push for rent or commercial rent stabilization, so that in those cases where a business like your father's is in the storefront or on the ground level of a corporate landlord's building, that they can't maybe utilize some of the crises that we're talking about to place more costs on you or to get more money out of you and your father's business. So I certainly see commercial rent stabilization as a path for us to take in order to solve some of the problems that you raised.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm confident Zohran thinks that supporting small businesses in New York City is a very positive goal, and nobody wants to present small businesses as the enemy. I think we want to avoid a sort of creating a conflict where there really isn't one and doesn't need to be one. I think the notion that stabilizing rents is going to lead to rents being raised for small businesses, I think that's not really how things work. Again, your related company is a business. They own buildings in order to make a profit from them. That's the goal. And they are going to be charging their commercial tenants the highest rent that they can charge and still have that storefront occupied. And if they're making more money somewhere else on their residential buildings, great, then they've got more money. If they're not making money on the residential buildings, it's not going to change their behavior because, again, they're already trying to squeeze as much out of their commercial tenants as they can. So if you want to limit how much they can squeeze out of the commercial tenants, you have to change the rules about commercial landlords and their tenants through something like commercial rent stabilization. I think on the minimum wage, you know, James Parrott, who might be in the room here tonight, has a new report out on the minimum wage from the Center for New York City Affairs. Is where you are now, right? Yeah, which I think is really really should be required reading on the $30 minimum wage. And I think one of the things he points out is that the $30 today, it sounds like a big number, of course, but relative to the city median, it's actually not much higher than $15 minimum wage was when that was adopted. So it's not as radical an increase as it sounds like. And of course, the other thing that matters to you as a small business is the incomes of your customers. So, you know, wages in New York are not just a cost for business owners in New York. They're also a major source of demand, especially, I would imagine, a business like the one you're talking about, a very large fraction of the customers live and work in New York City. So it's not, when you talk about a higher minimum wage, you're not talking just about an increase in the cost of the people who work there. You're also talking about an increase in the incomes of the people who spend money there. And I think, you know, historically, New York City has been a high wage city, and I think in many ways that's actually been a source of economic strength.
I think that's a good place to end. Cea, Josh, thank you so much. Please hang out, drink the beer. We'll move the chairs away.